Here's what almost no one anticipated. While most people were asleep last night, the U.S. economy absorbed a blow that will drain billions of dollars. And I'm not referring to some abstract fluctuation on Wall Street or a temporary dip that rebounds by noon. I'm talking about real money leaving the system, American companies watching customers disappear overnight. And the most shocking part? This damage is entirely self-inflicted. Let me set the scene. At this very moment, hotel owners in Montana are staring at nearly empty parking lots. Restaurant operators in Maine are facing vacant dining rooms during what should be their busiest stretch of the year. Ski resorts in Vermont are watching reservations collapse. What connects all of them? They're bleeding revenue because their most reliable customers simply stopped coming. Canadians, by far the largest international visitor group to the United States, are gone. And then things escalated. South Korean automakers were suddenly hit with new tariff threats that sent their share prices tumbling. These are not fringe companies. These are firms running massive manufacturing facilities inside the U.S., employing thousands of American workers. Now executives are staring at spreadsheets asking a serious question. Does it still make sense to stay in the American market at all? But none of this is happening in isolation. This is the direct consequence of decisions being made right now in Washington. Choices that are actively redefining what U.S. trade policy looks like. And the numbers should alarm you. Let's go beyond the headlines because they don't capture the scale. Multiple sources confirm Canadian tourism to the U.S. has fallen nearly 40% compared to last year. That's not a slowdown, that's a collapse. The estimated hit? Up to $5.7 billion in lost tourism spending annually. Pause on that number. $5.7 billion. That's not theoretical. That's revenue American businesses were counting on. Hotels, diners, gas stations, souvenir shops, theme parks, gone. Now here's where everything shifts. The administration just announced tariffs on South Korean imports would rise from 15% to 25%. The reason? South Korea's legislature didn't move quickly enough to ratify a trade agreement. And the consequences are sweeping. Autos, pharmaceuticals, lumber, everything covered under what are being labeled reciprocal tariffs. Shares of Hyundai and Kia fell about 4% in early trading. That might not sound catastrophic until you remember these companies operate enormous U.S.-based plants, rely on American suppliers, and employ American workers. And now they're calculating whether staying makes financial sense. And it didn't stop there. The president also threatened Canada with a 50% tariff on aircraft, every plane built in Canada, Bombardier, de Havilland, even Airbus jets assembled in Canadian facilities. Then came the escalation, a threat to decertify Canadian-built aircraft currently flying in U.S. airspace. There are roughly 150 Bombardier Global Express business jets registered in the United States, corporate aircraft used by major firms and wealthy individuals, all potentially grounded or facing enormous new compliance costs. But that still wasn't the real shock. Behind the scenes, the administration also warned Canada of a possible 100% tariff. Yes, 100%, if Prime Minister Mark Carney moves forward with a trade arrangement with China. Let that sink in. A 100% tariff means a $100 Canadian product suddenly costs $200 to import. That's not trade policy, that's an economic blockade. And it's being aimed at America's largest trading partner, the country the U.S. does roughly $3.6 billion in trade with every single day. Here's why this is so extreme. Canada is the top export destination for 36 U.S. states. Nearly 60% of U.S. crude oil imports come from Canada. About 85% of electricity imports. Canada is also the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium to the United States. And yet the threat on the table would effectively shut all of that down over a limited trade discussion with China that Ottawa says is primarily about resolving agricultural tariff disputes. What's becoming clear is this isn't really about trade deficits or national security. Internal documents suggest it's about leverage, using tariffs as a blunt instrument in every negotiation, rewriting the rules of global commerce unilaterally. Here's what the latest data shows. Between January and October of last year, passenger vehicle crossings from Canada into the U.S. dropped nearly 20% compared to the same period in 2024. In some border states, the decline reached 27%. Maine fell 25%, Montana 19%. Washington state saw a 27% drop in Canadian overnight stays. Businesses in Bellingham report Canadian traffic has fallen so sharply they can no longer rely on cross-border customers at all, which raises the core question. When you scare away your biggest customers, threaten your most important suppliers, and make it painful for allies to do business with you, what's the strategy? Does this strengthen America, or does it turn American businesses into collateral damage in a trade war no one voted for? Then came another shock. While Canada was being threatened with aircraft tariffs, South Korea woke up to a social media post announcing an overnight tariff hike. No diplomatic warning, no formal notice, just a post. To understand the impact, consider this. South Korea's economy grew only 1% last year, the weakest performance since the pandemic. Exports make up 44% of its GDP. Nearly half of its economy depends on selling goods abroad. After China, its largest export market is the United States. So a jump from 15% to 25% tariffs isn't a nuisance, it's an existential risk. Reports now indicate Korean factories are reevaluating their U.S. investments altogether. Hyundai exported 1.1 million vehicles to the U.S. in 2024. Kia follows a similar model. These aren't just imports. They're vehicles assembled with American labor, American components, and American supply chains. But when costs spike unpredictably, companies don't wait it out. They calculate losses. They consider exits. South Korea's trade minister immediately flew to Washington for emergency talks. The presidential office convened crisis meetings. Parliament rushed to fast-track investment legislation. Yet, the deeper problem remains. What message does this send to every other country watching? If the U.S. can raise tariffs overnight by executive order, without Congress, without warning, based on foreign legislative timelines, how does anyone plan long-term business with America? Here's where it gets legally dangerous. The administration is relying on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a 1977 law intended for genuine national emergencies. Terrorism, rogue states, imminent threats, not trade disputes, not negotiation tactics. Multiple federal courts have already ruled that many of these tariffs violate the law. Appeals courts agree. The Supreme Court is now deciding whether the president even has this authority. But until a final ruling comes, the tariffs stay, meaning American companies and consumers are paying billions right now, possibly for years, before refunds are even theoretically available. Meanwhile, retaliatory tariffs now threaten $223 billion in U.S. exports. China has already targeted American meat and soybeans. Europe is preparing $28 billion in countermeasures. Canada imposed $30 billion immediately and threatened another $125 billion. Add it all together, and economists estimate U.S. GDP could shrink by 0.7%. That's not a rounding error. That's jobs, wages, retirements. One Montana hotel owner reported a $38,000 loss after a single Canadian sports team canceled 70 rooms. One decision. Multiply that across thousands of businesses in every border state. Surveys show 70% of affected businesses blame Trump's trade war and rhetoric. Not a majority, 70%. And Canadians aren't just staying home, they're organizing a 1.4 million member boycott group, apps that flag American products, provinces pulling U.S. alcohol from shelves, Ontario canceling a $100 million Starlink contract, Nova Scotia doubling bridge tolls for U.S. trucks, entire liquor boards refusing U.S. imports. This isn't passive, it's coordinated. A Vermont restaurant owner testified, "This is long-term damage. Emotional damage takes time to heal. People will build new traditions elsewhere, and we won't get all of them back." That's the real cost. And then things crossed into uncharted territory. Legal experts now warn the administration may ignore court rulings if tariffs are struck down. The president suggested reversing them would be too messy. Translation: even if courts rule against them, don't expect compliance. This pattern extends beyond trade. Judges have issued orders the administration has technically acknowledged but effectively ignored. In one case, even after the Supreme Court ordered the return of a wrongly deported man, the administration argued facilitate didn't mean bring back. The man remains abroad. Chief Justice John Roberts publicly warned about threats to judicial independence, an extraordinary move. Vice President J.D. Vance questioned whether judges should restrain executive power at all. That's not routine politics. That's constitutional crisis territory. Internationally, the damage is accelerating. At Davos, Prime Minister Mark Carney warned of a rupture, not a transition. The response from Washington? A reminder that Canada lives because of the United States. That's not diplomacy. That's coercion. Canada's China agreement? Narrow, limited, agricultural tariff relief, and a modest EV import cap. Yet Washington treats it as betrayal, threatening tariffs that would end $800 billion in annual trade. If this strategy succeeds once, it becomes precedent. South Korea today, Japan next, Europe after. And here's the fear keeping economists up at night. What happens when countries decide the U.S. market isn't worth the submission required to access it? We're already seeing hints. Canada's tourism hit record highs from Europeans avoiding the U.S. for political reasons. Surveys in the UK, France, and Germany show over half are more likely to visit Canada instead. America's soft power is eroding fast. Once that reputation is damaged, it takes decades to rebuild. So where does this end? The Supreme Court's ruling will shape executive power for generations. Congress is pushing back, but vetoes loom. Businesses are bleeding now. Border states are losing tens of thousands of jobs. Supply chains are fracturing. Global growth is slowing, according to the International Monetary Fund, and much of this damage comes not from tariffs themselves, but from the threat of them. So I'll ask the same question. Is this strength, or is it self-destruction? Because from here, it looks like we're dismantling decades of trust, by choice. Let me know what you think.